maturity to earn the full discount.
You talk about how the law of supply and demand is not applicable to the retail trade. Explain that. That is fascinating.
Oh yeah. Well, this rigid. Let's put it that way. A rigid supply and demand model is not applicable.
Explain the law of supply and demand to the audience, please. Can you?
Okay. Now, this doesn't have to be taken literally.
Okay.
The model, the supply and demand model, is too rigid. It does not take into account that if the demand all of a sudden, without prior notice, explodes, then the supply is not there. So what will happen? According to this model, the price will go sky high. The hula hoops will cost 10 times as much as normally it would. However, under the Real Bill Doctrine, this is not what is going to happen. If the demand for hula hoops explodes for psychological reasons, because nobody knows what those little girls think who want their hula hoop. You know, they might want to imitate their little friends, or they just came to realize that this is a wonderful way to exercise or to improve their skills or show off or what have you. It cannot be predicted. But once the demand materializes, then, and it's explosive, as I said, then there's no need for the price of hula hoops to go sky high, because the bill market will adjust immediately. The real bills financing of hula hoops production and distribution is going to be available, and the price is not going to be affected. And that's what I mean by saying that the supply and demand model doesn't apply. As I say, this does not have to be taken literally, but it takes a little closer explanation that the market, the real bills will facilitate the supply and demand model to adjust itself almost instantaneously.
That's exciting.
To any changes which may occur for whatever reason. And if you take the real bills out of the system, then the system will become rigid and prices could react violently to any change of the demand which was not expected. And that is what I mean by that phrase.
I appreciate you explaining that. You speak also about gold is the only extinguisher of debt, and that we're not experiencing right now a gold crisis, it's a dollar crisis that's going on. You talk about the gross ration between private debt to nominal GDP. Can you explain that?
Well, if there are no gold coins in circulation, as we don't have them now, then there is no ultimate extinguisher of debt in the system. Because when you pay your debt with paper money, say Federal Reserve notes, the debt is not really extinguished. Now, your debt is, but debt as an entity, as an economic entity, is not extinguished because it's just transferred. You have transferred your debt to the Federal Reserve Bank. Or, well, normally you won't deal with the Federal Reserve Bank or one of the Federal Reserve Banks. You will deal with friendly neighborhood bank, okay? So you repaid your loan, then you transfer your debt to your bank. And if the money, say Federal Reserve notes, are in the hands of that bank and they are in surplus because they are not making new loans, then this bank will ship the Federal Reserve back to the Federal Reserve Bank in the district. So again, in retirement of the banks indebtedness to the Federal Reserve Bank. So once more, the debt is not extinguished. It's just transferred one step further back, and that's the way it is. In other words, the debt once created is just there. It's never ever again extinguished. So this talk, which we hear so much nowadays about, quantitative easing, but it has to be unwound, and it has to be, you have to have an exit strategy, and so on. You have heard this kind of talk in the newspapers and officials, and what they talk about is nonsense, because once they had this quantitative easing, which is just another fancy word for expanding debt, this extra debt which they have created stays in the system. It's not possible to extinguish it, because there's no ultimate extinguisher of debt.
Isn't this a form of fudging the accounting and cooking the books? In essence, this whole thing with GDP appears to me as being fake, because the books of the banks and the central banking system are cooked. There's no transparency. There's derivatives into the quadrillions. There are all these toxic assets on the books. Isn't the way GDP is formulated off kilter? It's not accurate.
I definitely have to agree with that. There's a lot of junk in the GDP. You know, if you hire, as Keynes, this famous British economist of the 20th century, suggested, you put dollar bills into Coke bottles and then bury them, and then hire unemployed people to dig them up again. You know, that will show up in the GDP as a wonderful increase in employment and so on and so forth. In other words, the GDP could have a lot of junk in it, and it's just no good to mix them up with the real production, which is absolutely necessary for the consumer to function. And therefore, I am not one of them who are crazy about macroeconomics. It has its place, but to pretend that these big aggregates, economic aggregates, behave as individuals do, it doesn't make sense.
So specifically, what would you put in your criteria of what the GDP should consist of? Give me some examples. GDP should consist of the following parameters. What would your boundaries be?
Well, you know, it's difficult to answer this question on such short notice.
Okay, well, I'd be very don't worry about it. But I think it's a critical question, because that's the underlying framework for looking at the true health of what's going on.
Okay. Well, I make a try anyhow.